let's see, just as a matter of orientation a little bit here, this is the endocrine system, which is all your glands, basically. Now, this textbook and this course kind of strips a lot of the endocrine stuff away from the endocrine chapter. In other words, all of the reproductive hormones, the estrogen, testosterone, and all that stuff, that all gets handled in the reproductive chapter. All of the GI hormones, like gastrin and cholecystokinin and all of those things, they get handled in the GI chapter, or the digestive system chapter. So this tends to be kind of a shorter chapter, I think. And so we're going to get through it today, I promise you. And the second thing I would tell you is that this is the last of the material that will be covered on the second exam. Right? Isn't that what the schedule says? So as of Wednesday, we will start lecturing on blood. I believe that's the first chapter in the cardiovascular system. We talk about the blood, we talk about the heart, then we talk about cardiac physiology and things like that. So the last unit of 232 is entirely about blood and blood circulation in the heart. Okay? So this is it. This is the end of the stuff, basically, for the second set. I got that right, don't I? I'm not talking out of school here. I found that the schedule was changed on me. Here we go, right here. This is all in here. Let's just look at that. Yeah, endocrine.
So that's 17 and 18, or 16 through 18?
7 and 16, autonomic nervous system, which we covered on the last exam. So this is just 2 chapters, yeah, 17 and 18. And I've even fought to not have this second exam. Just combine maybe one of the chapters with the first exam and one of the chapters with the second exam, and just have 2 exams in A and P2. But I've kind of gotten overruled by powers that be, and that's okay. So here we go. Endocrine system. So when you think of the endocrine system, besides the things I've already mentioned, what do you think about? Huh? Hormones, okay. So what are hormones? Let's talk about that real quick. Chemical messengers, that's right. They're things that are created by one organ. They're deposited out into the blood. Remember, because they're endocrine, which means what does endocrine mean? The word endocrine means no ducts, right? Exocrine means ducts. So like a lot of our glands have a duct that carries the stuff into some other cavity or something. But the endocrine system doesn't. They don't have any ducts. The blood just goes through them, releases the hormones. They circulate around through the blood, and they affect other organs. And just so you know, sometimes sometimes they affect lots of organs. Okay. So this is a quick run through of what we're going to be talking about here, and some of what we won't be talking about. The hypothalamus up in the brain that we just finished, remember, it makes ADH and oxytocin. Those are the 2 main hormones that are made actually by the posterior hypothalamus. And then there's a bunch of regulatory hormones, and that means things like releasing factors, thyroid releasing factors, and so forth and so on. And we'll go through that one by one here, but that's where they live, up in the brain, just above the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, which is also called the master gland or the main gland, it receives a bunch of stimulating hormones from the hypothalamus, and here's the list of them. We're going to go through these pretty carefully, and you need to know all of these. You need to know these hormones and what they do, where they come from, and what they do. ACTH stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. It has to do with the adrenocortical cortex of the adrenal gland, releases a series of hormones. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. GH is growth hormone. PRL, this is kind of a funny one, it's prolactin. Prolactin is the things that makes your breasts make milk and makes your and does other things for you. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. You'd think that's only in women, but actually there's FSH in men too to make you make sperm cells. LH is luteinizing hormone, and MSH is melanocyte stimulating hormone. We'll talk about that. That's what makes you darker. Your skin darker, makes more melanin. Neurohypophysis is the back part of the pituitary gland, which is in direct communication with the hypothalamus up there, because you see these two hormones, ADH and oxytocin, are actually made in the hypothalamus, but they are released in the pituitary gland. We'll go over that again. Pineal gland makes melatonin. Parathyroid glands, which live on the back of your thyroid gland in your neck, they make a really important hormone called PTH, parathyroid hormone, and that is the one that controls your calcium levels to a great degree. We're gonna spend a lot of time over the next 3 months in 2 and 3, in 232 and 233 about calcium levels, because calcium is such an important electrolyte in your body. Two other hormones that are made by your heart itself, atrial natriuretic peptide and brain natriuretic peptide. We'll talk about them, but we will talk about them later in chapter 21. Here's the rest of them. The thyroid gland makes T3 and T4. That's triiodothyronine, which means it has 3 iodines attached to it, and thyroxine, which is T4, also called thyroid hormone, although they're both really thyroid hormones. It has 4, that's why it's called T4. Calcitonin is another hormone that's released in the thyroid gland that controls calcium. Now remember, we just talked about the parathyroid glands. They live in the back of the thyroid gland, and they release PTH. PTH will raise your calcium level. Calcitonin will lower your calcium level. We'll go through those more carefully. The thymus, you don't really have to worry much about it. It's this organ here in your chest. Only time I ever really thought about the thymus gland was in doing heart surgery. When you cut the sternum up the middle here, you would see the thymus. And if you were operating on a child, the thymus was really pretty big. If you were operating on an adult, the thing was all shriveled up and it was just a bunch of little wad of fat, really is about all it amounted to. So it atrophies with life. The important thing maybe about the thymus gland is that's where T cells are formed. And if you have a friend who has AIDS, or you know anything about AIDS, you know that T cell counts are very important. And they're called T cells because they were originally formed in the thymus gland. The suprarenal glands are also called the adrenal glands. In this course, the book, they call them suprarenal gland. I guess that's a more politically correct answer, because adrenals came from the Lilly Drug Company when they got the generic name for epinephrine. They started calling it by their trade name, which was adrenaline. And so I think that's why the books have moved away from calling these the adrenal glands. Anyway, we call them the suprarenal glands. And there's several parts of the suprarenal gland, which we'll go through. There's the medulla. The medulla is the middle part, medulla, and it makes epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then there's the rest of the adrenal gland called the suprarenal cortex, and it makes all kinds of cool things for you, like cortisol, corticosteroid. Those are basically your steroid hormones, what you think of as steroid hormones. Aldosterone is a very important one that controls your salt in your body. And then there's androgens like testosterone. So this area right in here is where a lot of the performance enhancing drugs come into play. in athletes that are trying to make themselves go faster, stronger, or whatever. The kidney makes several hormones as well. One is erythropoietin. Does anybody know what EPO is, erythropoietin? We'll go back to performance-enhancing drugs for a second. This is the drug that Lance Armstrong was taking all the time, along with small doses of testosterone. His whole team and most all the bikers in the world were taking EPO. Erythropoietin makes your body make more blood cells. So if normally my blood count is about 46%, in other words, 46% of my blood, if you spin it down, is blood cells. The other 54% is plasma, water. EPO kicks in if you lose blood. Like if you have a bleeding episode for some reason and your blood count drops, then the EPO kicks in to make your body build up more blood. Well, what the athletes figured out is that they can just take this EPO and it would push their blood count up. So instead of being 46 like me, I could probably pump it up to 54. Well, you give yourself another 8% of blood cells in your blood, and blood cells basically just carry oxygen, right? Then you've got more oxygen carrying capacity, and when you get to the mountain at the end of the 8-hour day of bike riding, you go up the mountain and the other guys are sucking wind back there because they don't have as much blood count as you do. Now there's other ways to cheat the system. We'll talk about those as we go through all of this. But EPO is certainly a very interesting drug that has been used. And of course now they have blood tests that can tell the difference between manufactured EPO, synthesized EPO, and natural EPO. So that's how they caught them. Calcitriol is another hormone released by the kidney. We'll talk about it later. Leptin is the problem in America. Probably the #1 health problem in America right now is diabetes type 2, type 2 diabetes. Basically everyone that's overweight has some problems with their blood sugars, and the reason is because the fat in your body everywhere releases leptin. And leptin is kind of like an anti-insulin drug. It causes the insulin that you have to not work very well. So that's the problem. We'll talk about it. The digestive tract makes lots of hormones. We're not going to talk about them in this chapter at all. The pancreas has these little islets in it. 99% of the pancreas makes pancreatic juice. It's an exocrine gland that makes pancreatic juice that dumps fluid into the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, and digests your food. So it makes a bunch of different enzymes that break down fats, lipases that break down proteins, proteases, and has, what's the last one? Fats, carbos, amylases, yeah. What?
So people that have type 1 diabetes, is it just those, is it the islets of Langerhans, are those, is it just that portion?
They're destroyed, yes.
But the rest of
their pancreas usually works fine in type 1. Yeah, the problem is in type 1 diabetes, which we used to call early onset diabetes because it usually happened in kids. Kids would be perfectly fine. They'd come home from school on a Friday. They'd have a little flu or a little virus or some kind of little cold or sickness over the weekend, and come by Monday night they had a blood sugar of 1600 and they were in coma because it just wipes out all of their islets of Langerhans in literally one day. And so from that point forward they can't make any insulin at all. That's only the type 1s, which is not the most common type by far, but they can't make any insulin. So those kids for the rest of their life, every day, multiple times a day, are taking insulin shots. Okay, glucagon is another hormone made by the pancreatic islets. It raises sugar, whereas insulin brings it down. Then these little gonad things, males and females both have a set. Testes in males, ovaries in females, and they make a bunch of hormones which are listed here. Androgens is kind of the class name for all the male hormones. The main one, of course, is testosterone. Inhibin is a hormone we'll talk about more when we get to the reproductive system. The ovaries of a female make estrogens, make progestins, and make inhibin. Back in the day, in the early days of my surgical career, so say the 70s, when ladies had breast cancer, we knew that one of the things that made their breast cancer grow worse was estrogens, female hormones. Stimulated the breast, it stimulated the breast cancer cells, made them go crazy and usually die. And so we would then operate on them and take their ovaries out. Not only take their ovaries out, but also take their adrenal glands out, because they both made some of those female hormones. And by doing that, you took all those hormones away, and the ladies would generally live longer, or their cancer would go into remission. Through the magic of pharmacology these days, you don't have to do that. We give them a little pill that is an anti-estrogen drug that just goes around and eats up all their estrogen in their body. So they don't have to have surgery anymore. And that drug is called tamoxifen. We'll talk about it more when we get to that thing. Okay, so that's just a rough overview of what we're going to be talking about today, the different organs, the different hormones. I think it's important that you kind of keep this all in mind and realize that we've talked about the nervous system in great length and how the nervous system controls things that happen instantly. You step on a needle, on a pin, you have a reflex, and you pull your foot back off of it. The endocrine system is more a long-term thing. The endocrine system determines how tall you get. It determines how muscularly developed you are, and it certainly determines your reproductive factors. It determines when you go into menarche, when women start having periods, when you start developing secondary sexual traits. Women form breasts, men get hairy, all that kind of stuff. And the way this endocrine system controls all of that stuff is through these chemical messengers that you mentioned at the very beginning, that sends these instructions between the cells. How do cells communicate? Let's just digress from this just a little bit. And please, the book has pages and pages on this stuff, okay? I'm sorry, but I just don't think going into all of the inner workings of how these things work is really important. So I would tell you for this lecture, like I've told you for a couple of other lectures, pay attention to what I talk about and don't worry about the other parts in the book, okay? I always say that with a grain of sand, because somebody says, well, you didn't specifically mention this and you asked a question about it. Well, be cool, okay? We're in college here, but basically I don't want you to go through all the stuff about the inner workings of all of these things. Paracrine communication is basically cell to cell. In other words, if I'm low on sodium and my neighbor next door, the cell living next door is low on sodium, we'll kind of work together and signal to each other to kind of fix that. And because of that, it's everywhere. It's all throughout your body. And really, it's the most common form of intercellular communication. Now, this is not something from Star Wars or something, intercellular or intergalactic or something. This is just from one cell to the cell next to it. Okay? Endocrine communication, however, is much more complex. It involves the creation of these hormones, these special chemicals. They are made in endocrine cells, and there's cells scattered through all these organs that I just kind of went over with you. They're released into the bloodstream. Once they're in the bloodstream, they travel around through your whole body, and depending on whether the organ that you're talking about reacts to that hormone or not, it will affect those cells there. A lot of times a single hormone, like your thyroid hormone, will affect virtually every organ, every cell in your body. It sets the level of activity in every cell. So when you hear the word, he's hyper, what you're really talking about is somebody who's hyperthyroid. They're just like jittery and going, and their body's warm and all this kind of stuff, and so forth. So we'll talk about that more in detail, but basically just know that a single hormone can affect lots of organs throughout your body. Make sense? I hope. Target cells are the ones that actually read these messages from these hormones. So there are specific cells that possess specific receptors that bind onto and read these hormonal messages. So if there's thyroid hormone flying by in your bloodstream and it runs by some of these target cells, those target cells say, wait a minute, we got a lot of thyroid hormone here, let's bind onto it and read it, and then that's going to tell us to do something inside our cell. Maybe to turn our mitochondria on and make more energy, it may be to turn our ribosomes on and make more proteins, or all kinds of different things. You all remember those words from 112, right? You thought you'd never have to know that again. Oh well. So these hormones are almost all, some of the things they do, the way they really affect their target organs is they may stimulate the synthesis of more enzymes or more proteins. If you're taking hormones to make your body get bigger, you're taking testosterone hormones to build muscle, then it's going to stimulate the enzymes in your muscle cells to make more proteins. And you're going to build more muscle. Sometimes it decreases the amount of synthesis of one thing or another. And I think it's just important that you know that the way this whole thing works is simply by turning these membrane channels. They're almost always in the membrane. Because remember, here's a cell, it's surrounded by a membrane. Here's hormones that are flying by in the bloodstream or in the interstitial fluid. The way the hormones work is by attaching to a binding mechanism, a reading part that is part of the membrane of the cell, the outside of it. They can go into the cell, but mainly what they do is they react with the outer cell, and then that then carries the message on inside to the inside of the cell. The hormones are divided into three groups: amino acids and peptides. Now, the only difference, of course, between an amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, right? And peptides are, they're short proteins, right? They're little pieces of proteins. They're kind of baby proteins. They can get big enough and become a protein, but they're short peptide hormones. And then there's lipid derivatives, and those are fats. So a lot of our hormones are built from fat, which is probably one of the reasons that we fat people have problems sometimes with all this stuff. Most of the time, the hormones do not just circulate around by themselves. Almost never. If thyroid hormone just circulated around through your body, it would be gone in about an hour. But instead, it binds on to a transport protein. So you've got that thyroid hormone bound to a transport protein, and it can float around in your body for weeks, okay? Doing its thing, but not getting digested because it's tied on to the transport protein. Here you go. Free hormones remain functional for less than an hour. They get eaten up, broken down by the liver, kidney, and enzymes break them down, enough said. That's why they bind on to transport proteins to keep them working. Some of our hormones, and the example they give here is thyroid hormones and steroid hormones, remain in the circulation for a very long time, become attached to a special transport protein, and they just keep going. So our bloodstream may contain a very substantial reserve of these bound hormones. So that if your thyroid completely shut down and wasn't making any hormone, you'd still have a lot of thyroid hormone that would last for quite a long time. What's a hormone receptor? Well, that's the thing that these hormones can bind onto strongly. And sometimes a single hormone receptor can bind onto several different hormones. And sometimes different tissues have different combinations of receptors. So a single cell, a single muscle cell, might respond to testosterone, it might respond to estrogen, it might respond to thyroid hormone. All of those different hormones will affect that muscle cell in one way or another, either turning it on, making it grow more, making it make more protein, or turning it off. So really the whole thing boils down to, the way this whole system works is based on the sensitivity of these receptors to a certain hormone. Yes?
Are hormone receptors the same thing as protein receptors? Or are those two different things?
They are proteins. Are they protein receptors? Yeah, I think you'd say they're protein receptors. I think I've got a couple pictures that talk about that maybe a little more. These receptors are basically built into the plasma membrane, and some of them, like catecholamines, and catecholamines is another name for epinephrine, norepinephrine. Those are catechols. I think that word skips by some of you, so that's why I'm pointing it out, because I think some people in previous tests have said, well, what's a catechol? We never heard that term before. Well, there it is. So you know. The problem with these is they are not lipid soluble, and because they're not lipid soluble, they can't work their way through the plasma membrane to get into the cell. All they can do is bind onto these receptors that are on the outer surface of the plasma membrane. That's what I was mentioning before. Really, a lot of these hormones, they don't ever go into the cell. They just attach to these receptors that are on the surface of the cell. And then they're going to send what we call a second messenger. Another chemical is going to be created that's going to be then passed into the, say, the nucleus or the ribosomes to make things happen. So the way these guys work is that, like I just said, the first messenger is the hormone that attaches to this thing on the surface of the membrane. The first messenger then makes a second messenger. And that second messenger can be a series of different things. This is what I said, don't worry too much in the book. It goes into such detail. And that second messenger might act as an activator to make the cell do more stuff. It may act as an inhibitor to make it do less stuff. Or it may work as a cofactor where you need this cofactor to react with something else to then make some other chemical reaction happen. Obviously, the whole thing works on chemical reactions, and a lot of it is the amount of second messenger present results in a change in the rates of different metabolic reactions. Now, I'm not trying to bore you with really silly details, but just know that this is kind of the general way in which hormones work. Some of the second messengers that you will hear about in your career, because a lot of these second messengers, this is the way drugs work, different pharmacology drugs work to act as second messengers themselves. Cyclic AMP, which is a derivative of ATP, cyclic GMP, which is also a derivative of GTP, and calcium. Calcium is a very important second messenger. That's why I mentioned already that we'll be talking about the levels of calcium that we have in our body in great detail, because it has a lot of effects, especially on muscle. Remember how calcium was important in causing the reaction between the myosin and the actin to make muscles contract? Well, there's an example of where it works. Another thing that happens is this process called amplification. In other words, you may have a single molecule of thyroid hormone that comes around and binds onto this membrane receptor. But that membrane receptor then makes 10,000 molecules of the second messenger, okay? So that's the process of amplification. In other words, it only takes a tiny, tiny bit of hormone to create jillions, thousands of second messengers, which really magnifies the effect of this single hormone cell single hormone protein that I just mentioned, that affected the target cell. So between the first messenger and the second messenger, there can be a huge amplification, which then results in a huge effect. One of the ways these things work is they alter the DNA transcription rate. Obviously, if you change the rate of transcription of DNA and creating new DNA and creating messenger RNA and all that stuff, then you can increase the metabolic activity, the structure, and so forth. This is one of the ways that steroid hormones and thyroid hormones work. We have endocrine reflexes, and this is a fancy term that I would like to just explain to you in a simple fact, in a simple illustration. Let's just say, you remember the term negative feedback, right? Negative feedback was like the thermometer on the wall from day one of 231. You remember that? There's a picture of a thermometer in the book. Anyway, so let's just say you have, you're sitting there and the thyroid hormone is really pouring out from your thyroid gland. And suddenly your body realizes, wait a minute, we've got too much thyroid hormone. So then there's a reflex that sends a message back to the pituitary gland. It says, hey, pituitary, we've got too much thyroid down here. We're getting hyperthyroid. Turn off the thyroid. And so what it does is it secretes thyroid inhibiting factor, cuts down on the amount of thyroid releasing factor that it was sending out, and that cuts down the amount of thyroid hormone so that we all stay at a normal level of thyroid hormone production. Okay? So that's a reflex. Most of them are negative feedback. Mostly they work by chemicals. A few of them we'll talk about, most of them we won't. But I think just know that these reflexes, they stimulate production of a hormone or they reduce the intensity of the release of the hormone. Let's talk about the pituitary gland first. You can say pituitary gland, you can say hypophysis. They mean exactly the same thing. Okay? So you'll hear me probably in this little talk this morning talk about both of them. The hypophysis lives in the cella turcica. You remember that? What does cella turcica mean? What does cella turcica mean? Turkish saddle. Remember that? From when you were studying the bones in the inside of the brain?